And so what we're going to talk about today is really kind of a deep dive into how we actually make memories. And as part of that, so first we're going to talk about sort of, what does it mean to make a memory? How does that work in terms of our brain? And where does it go wrong? So we'll talk about both memory and forgetting. And then towards the end of the session today, we'll also talk a little bit about what we can do, right? So given what we know about how we make memories, how can we actually make that a little bit better? And so I'm going to focus primarily on how memory works more in general, but I will kind of detour in places where we can talk a little bit more specifically about how that can change in MCI and what we can do about it. All right. And I see there are already things in the chat. Oh, okay. All right, so how we make memories. All right, so starting off, I want to just make sure that we're all kind of on the same page about what memory is. And so memory is the process of taking in information from the world around us, processing it, storing it, and later recalling that information. As we all know, we have memory for many different types of things, and we're often trying to remember that information maybe one day later, but then also maybe 20 years later, 50 years later. So our memories do a lot of heavy lifting in terms of kind of keeping a track record of our lives and our experiences and really contribute to our sense of who we are. So memory is really, really important to us as people. And as I hope that you're already kind of picking up on, it's a pretty complicated process in terms of our brains. And so it's really important for us to kind of understand how memory works if we're trying to improve our memories or if we're having trouble with memory. So as I've alluded to, there are many different types of memory. So most often we think of something called declarative memory, which is a type of long-term memory where we're remembering facts or we're remembering specific events. So if you remember a birthday party that you went to 20 years ago, that's a type of episodic memory. There's a specific event, you remember bits and pieces of that, maybe not everything, but you have a memory of it. That's a type of declarative memory, which means it was on purpose, and it fits in our long-term memory. The other type of declarative memory we have is for facts or concepts. So for example, knowing different animals is a type of semantic memory. It's not an event that we specifically remember, but it's a type of information that's really important to our day-to-day life. And those are things we effortfully learned at some point in our life. Now, the other type of long-term memory that we have is called implicit memory. This is a little more unconscious. So probably the easiest example here is something called procedural memory. So most of us on the call, even if we haven't touched a bike in, decades, we remember how to ride a bike. If we were to get on a bike, maybe we wouldn't do it perfectly on our first try, but we'd remember the bits and pieces and it would come back to us. Now, this is a type of long-term memory called implicit memory, and more specifically, procedural memory, which is how we remember to do things like play instruments, ride a bike, and specific movements without having to really think about it. In addition to long-term memory, we have a couple of other types of memory, which I'll actually talk about here in just a second. And the idea here is actually that sensory memories and short-term or working memory actually are kind of steps along the way to forming a long-term memory. So keeping in mind, we have a lot of different types of memory, and we'll talk a little bit more specifically about why this is important. And if you have not watched the Brain Myth Busted talk from about a month ago, I go into explicit and implicit memory a little more specifically there and have some really good examples. So if that's not something you've watched, I highly recommend it. Okay. So how do we form these memories? So a lot of times when we think about memories forming, if you think about, you're at your friend's home or a child's home, something like that, and you really want to remember an event, you might be thinking, okay, I'm going to remember just a light switch. Either I remember or I don't remember. And the truth is that memory is a lot more complicated than that. So memory is not like a light switch. It's not something we can just turn on and turn off. Instead, memory is actually a pretty complicated process that happens in the course of our brain. So let me just turn on my pointer here so you guys can follow along with where I'm at. So if we are trying to form a memory, the first thing that will happen is we have some kind of sensory input. So I'm going to use the example of like a conversation. So if we're trying to remember a conversation, the first thing that happens is that we hear those words, right? So maybe our partner is saying something to us. That sensory input into our ears, our auditory cortex, is going to create what we call a sensory memory. Now, these sensory memories are fleeting. It's just a brief second. If you think about, for example, if you hear those words and you can kind of remember what they sounded like, that is an example of a sensory memory. Now, what's really important at this stage is we have to pay attention to it in order for it to go into our short-term memory. So if we don't pay attention to that information, it's lost. So we have a lot of sensory memories throughout the day. Often, a majority of those are not going into our long-term memory. So these are going to be things like, what it felt like when you walked into a cold room. That's going to give you an immediate sensory memory. But unless we create some effort behind remembering that, we won't remember it because we have a lot of sensory experiences throughout the day. So anything we don't effortfully attend to will be lost at this stage. So let's say that conversation, those words come in our ear and we decide to pay attention to them. We're listening, we're paying attention. That moves them into our short-term memory, which you'll sometimes hear called working memory. And the idea here is that our short-term memory is really, really small, but this is where we can actively rehearse information. And if anyone has heard of the word encoding, this is kind of the first step in encoding information. So when that information comes in, it moves into our short-term memory, which is really limited. We only have about 3 to 7 pieces of information we can keep in there at a time. But from here, we decide, okay, is this something that I want to transfer into my long-term memory? If it is, we engage in something called rehearsal. So that information that goes into our short-term or our working memory does not automatically turn into a long-term memory without some kind of repetition or rehearsal. So if we really want to remember something, for example, that conversation that came in, if there's a piece of it you want to remember, you'll rehearse it, right? You'll say it over to yourself. Maybe you'll write it down. You'll make a sticky note for yourself. Those are all forms of rehearsal. And when you're doing that internally, that puts us into this process of encoding. So once we are in that process of encoding, that is when things start to move into our long-term memory storage. So through that rehearsal, repetition, we start to encode information and it goes into our long-term stores. Now, if we're not rehearsing information, it will get lost. The reason for that, again, is because a lot of things come into our working memory throughout the day and we can't remember all of them. So those things we choose to rehearse and repeat are going to be the things that are available for us to learn long-term. So once we've encoded information into that long-term memory, if it's stored, so some things, this is where we get into some potential causes of decline, but for most people, we're able to store that information and then retrieve it later. So retrieving it is when we go back in and, for example, your partner says, we had this conversation earlier, and you can go back and recall the details. That's retrieval. What that does is it brings that information back into your working and short-term memory, and you can interact with it again. Now, with long-term memory, it is normal for some of that information to be lost over time. So people have probably noticed that if you have a conversation, the next day, you probably remember most of it, but if someone asks you about a conversation from 3 months ago, you're going to have a hard time remembering that. And that's just a natural course of time with our memories. So over time, we tend to lose some of that information. Now, I know this is really complicated, but I want to kind of bring it into a more specific example. So let's, for example, say that we are meeting a new dog. We're at the dog park and a dog comes up and you meet this dog. His name is Jester. He's very cute. That first kind of, so that sensory memory piece of this is going to be your memory of maybe you hear him bark or he comes up and he licks you. That sensory memory is going to be just that fleeting kind of memory of seeing this dog, meeting this dog. Now, if you want to pay attention to the name, right? Let's say you're trying to remember the name, that's where that attention becomes important. We move into that stage of short-term or working memory, and that's where we'd start to rehearse it. So maybe you're saying it to yourself a couple of times. Maybe this dog is running back and forth in front of you and you're getting some rehearsal of, wait, that's Jester, that's Jester. And through that rehearsal, you can create long-term memory storage. Now, the next time you come to the dog park, that's when we're talking about retrieval. So you see the dog again, you think to yourself, oh, that's Jester. And again, as we talked about, there are multiple places along this pathway where you can start to lose that memory quality. And we'll talk about how to overcome that here in just a second. But in the process of learning this information, so in this case, that this dog's name is Jester, I also want to bring up this kind of concept of how our memories are organized. So once it's stored, that information goes to that long-term memory. We also want to think about the organization of that storage. Now, when we think about memory storage, probably the best kind of metaphor for how it works is actually thinking about kind of a spider web. So if we have a spider web, we've got a kind of center point and lots of spokes coming off of that with different connections between them. Now, when we think about memories, the kind of landscape of our memory is happening through a process of strengthening and weakening associations. So in this case, Jester is kind of a small light-colored dog, and that automatically will pair him, right, with other dogs that are similar. So you've probably met a lot of dogs in your life. It's going to automatically kind of move an association to be closer together with some of those other dogs that are more similar. This organization is really individual. So for example, maybe you're less concerned about the size. Maybe he has a behavior that kind of pairs him with something else. For example, if he barks a lot, that may kind of move him to a different semantic categorization, a different place on the web. And these webs overlap. So for example, you might have a web that's for dogs, you might have a web that's for carnivals. And because his name is Jester, not only are you strengthening that association within your dog web, you're also strengthening it within like a carnival web. And this is kind of how our memories work, through strengthening and weakening these different associations as we learn new information. Now, this becomes really, really important when we're trying to improve memory, because those associations are things that we can't force them to be something specific, but we can encourage different types of associations to improve our memory. Okay. And so I also want to talk here just really quickly about memory in general. So we tend to think of memory, this has been something I've talked to a lot of folks in our program about. When we think about memory, a lot of people have this conception that it should be perfect. It should be sort of like a video in your mind of something that's happened. So if you're not perfectly remembering, an important event in your life, that means there's something wrong. And the truth is that our memories don't really work like that. So we don't have sort of videos of our days stored in our head that we can go back to. And if only our memory was stronger, we would get it right. The truth is that our memories, even from the moment that they're created, are subject to bias. And that's not a bad thing. That's a natural thing when it comes to our brains. But this can affect both how we recall information and some of the changes that happen over time. So we know that our memories are subject to many biases. These are just a few, but they can affect how accurate our recollection is. So for example, there's something called the primacy and recency effect, which just means that we're more likely to forget things that are presented in the middle. So we tend to remember, for example, if you're trying to remember a grocery list, you're more likely to remember the first couple of items and the last couple of items than you are to remember things in the middle. This is just a natural way that memory works. Now, the other place to think about something like a primacy and recency effect is if you're having a conversation, right? So you are more likely to remember things that have happened in the beginning of the conversation and at the end of the conversation than something that's happening in the middle. We also have things like retrospective bias and confirmation bias that can impact the way that we look at memories that have already been stored or that are in the process of being stored. So in general, and again, this is natural, this is kind of how our brains work. We tend to view past memories as more favorable than more recent memories. So we tend to remember the past as being better. It's a little more favorable in terms of our mood and things like that than some things that are more recent. We also do something called confirmation bias, which means that we tend to look for information that confirms what we already know. So if you are someone that really likes chocolate ice cream, you're going to be someone that is more likely to notice and remember that more people in the ice cream shop had chocolate ice cream. That's an example of confirmation bias. So we tend to confirm those things that we believe. And then another important kind of piece to remember here is that our memories also naturally change over time. So if we accept that, there's not this video of an event that happened, and if our memories were just stronger, we would remember it perfectly. We also, after we've stored a memory, every time we access that memory, it changes a little bit. And again, this isn't a bad thing. This is a very normal thing. But what that can mean is that, that memory of your 5th birthday when you're 6 years old looks very different than when you're 45 years old, when you're 80 years old. So those memories change as we access them. And one way to think about that is that every time we kind of come back to a memory, we have different perspectives and life experiences, and that those things actually flavor those memories. So we maybe have new information that can change how we feel about those memories. And again, these are all very normal things. I just like to bring it up because I think, again, there's this misconception that we have kind of a video in our mind, and if we could just strengthen our brains, we would get it perfectly right. And that's just not how our memory works. Our memory is something that we've created, even from the very beginning. So speaking of brains, after I say that we we can't, use our brains to perfectly capture everything in the world around us, I do want to talk a little bit about how memory in the brain works. So many people have probably heard of a structure called the hippocampus, which is incredibly important to declarative memory, which, if you remember, is a part of long-term memory, one of those effortful types of memory where we remember episodes or events as well as facts. So things like, hope you can't see my pointer, one second. So things like the hippocampus, which is down here in blue, the amygdala, and actually this whole little circuit here are really important to that type of memory. So that's one of those kind of hotbeds for how we form those types of memories. Now, what's really important to keep in mind, and part of the reason that things like remembering how to ride a bike or remembering how to dance are not things that people lose, even as they are, having a progressive disease or something like that, is that this only really affects your declarative memory. Now, things like procedural memories actually live in a different part of the brain. So our procedural memories rely on something called the basal ganglia, which is here, as well as the cerebellum, which is back here. So they're actually separate memory systems, which is part of why we separate them when we talk about memory as neuropsychologists. And again, that's important to keep in mind because if people are having trouble with declarative memory, that doesn't mean that we're going to have trouble with every type of memory. The last thing I'll just say is we've also got the prefrontal cortex, which we typically think of as being a part of executive function and things like that, that can also impact memory. And when we talk about short-term memory and working memory, we're often talking more about this prefrontal cortex than we are either of these memory systems, but they all interact, right? So if you're having trouble with encoding, a lot of times that has to do with this prefrontal cortex, but it certainly affects your ability to store that information later. All right, I won't bore you guys with any more brain details. The most important thing there to take away is that we have separate memory systems and not all of them are impaired in any single disease. So how do we go through and actually access these memories? So we've got our nice webs of memories that are built on associations. We've got this kind of step-by-step process of how we actually form those memories, but how do we go back and access them? So I want you guys to think about a recipe for, or the last time maybe you made chocolate chip cookies and how you went about doing that. So most of us have made chocolate chip cookies at some point in our life, and we may be able to kind of piece together how to do it from memory. Now, there are different ways to actually access those types of memories. And it's really important to keep this in mind because when it comes to memory strategies, these are the types of things that we think about. So one way to access that learned information is called recall. Now, in the example of the chocolate chip cookies, this would be remembering the recipe from memory. So being able to say, you know what, I know we need 1 cup of chocolate chips, we need 1 cup of flour. Anyone who knows how to make chocolate chip cookies now knows that I do not. But remembering that recipe from memory without any sort of hints. So being able to just call it from your mind. Another way that we access that information is called recognition. So this is when we get hints or cues. And so, for example, this might mean that you have a, you have a mnemonic for how you remember that information, or, your mother or something taught you, this is how to think about it. And so you're using a specific strategy to do it. Now, typically recognition memory is a little bit easier than recall. The reason for that is when we think about recall, that's actually relying on a much more complicated process within our brain. Recognition is really relying primarily on storage. So when we get those hints, it allows us to bypass some of the really complicated stuff that our brain does to move through those webs that we've created and figure out exactly how to get back to that memory. Recognition allows us to kind of get back to the right web and just find the information. And then relearning is another way that we can actually access previously learned information. So people may have noticed that if you've made chocolate chip cookies before, even if you don't remember the recipe, even if you can't recall those details or recognize them if someone gives you hints, when you go back to do it a second time, typically it's going to happen faster or you'll feel more efficient at it. And that's something called relearning. And the idea there is that, maybe you aren't able to state what you know about it, but you've learned something in the past. And so when you come back, you're actually remembering pieces of it. Now, when it comes to MCI, we can actually have all 3 types of forgetting. And it's probably most common for people to have the most trouble with recall, where you're trying to remember it without any hints, without any cues, without kind of doing it again. And again, the reason for that is because that's really the most complicated way to remember something. What we tend to do, and folks that have worked with me before know, is actually recognition is super powerful because if the information has been stored, this will allow us to kind of get back to it. So creating recognition cues and ways to kind of work around that difficulty with recall can be super powerful for people with MCI. And I want to just make a note that this maps onto, so these types of memory actually map onto how and why tests are designed the way they are in schools. So for example, essay questions are a type of recall and they test your recall, whereas multiple choice questions actually test your recognition. So you don't have to recall it from nothing, you kind of have a cue. This is also for anyone that's ever done a neuropsych evaluation. This is part of why our memory tests are so long, because we actually look at recall, recognition, and relearning as part of that evaluation. Because for us, it's important to understand, what is going well and what is going less well. And I'm curious if anyone remembers the dog's name, but memory and forgetting, while they go hand in hand, are a little bit different. So there are also some reasons why we might forget. So if you're someone that doesn't remember the dog's name, there are a couple of reasons why that might be. The first one is a failure to store the memory. This is typically a problem with encoding. So this can be due to poor attention. So if you didn't attend to the information in the first place, you can't store it later on. It actually didn't get in, we can't store it. It can also be a problem with working memory or short-term memory. So if you're not rehearsing that information, if you're not kind of actively committing it to long-term memory, we can see that even if it started that encoding process, it didn't get all the way to storage. There's also something called interference. So people have probably experienced this, where if I told you to remember the dog's name, which is Jester for folks that are trying to remember, if I told you to remember that this dog's name is Jester, and then between the time that I told you and now, I filled it with a whole bunch of really distracting information. I asked you to count backwards from 100 by sevens or something like that. It's going to be a lot harder for you to actually remember that information than if I told you, you know what, you have 20 minutes, I'm going to come back and you can do whatever you need to do to remember that name. So interference is really, really critical. And this is incredibly important if you are someone that's having memory difficulties, to try to reduce interference, especially for kind of that period of time after you're learning something new, because that can give you that time to rehearse and repeat information. Another reason that we can forget is something called a retrieval failure. This is what we were talking about before, where the hardest way to get back to information is doing that kind of full recall circuit. It's much easier if we get cues or if we're able to kind of do it again. And so that retrieval failure is that inability to use the entire process to kind of get back to that information. That's the recall. And the reason that that is a place where we can fail to remember information, again, is because it's so many kind of steps in the process. So there's a lot of pieces of our brain that are involved in that. And when more of our brain gets involved, there are more places where it can go wrong. And then the last reason we forget is something called storage decay. And so the idea here is that even if information is stored, it's natural that over time, that information can decay. Now, most of the time, this is sort of less of a concern. Most of the time, the encoding or retrieval are where people fail at recalling the memory. But for example, although natural storage decay is natural, sometimes if people have like Alzheimer's disease, that storage decay might be kind of turned up a little bit. So it might be harder for them to actually store the information over time. And specifically what we see is that the natural rate of decay just gets a little bit steeper. All right, so we've talked a lot about what memory is and how we form memories, how we forget information, how we remember information. Now let's talk about how we can actually improve our memories. And I want to bring us back to kind of the two major points that we've talked about today. The first one being this memory circuit. So again, memory is not a light switch. We've got lots of stops along the way and lots of things we have to do in order to commit something to long-term memory. The second piece here is this idea of webs, right? So our memory is organized into these different webs. They connect to each other, and those associations are really important. So now when we're thinking about how we actually improve memories, we kind of want to hack these things. We want to think about, okay, what are the different pieces of this process that I can dip into and improve without having to strengthen the tissue itself, that I can kind of work around? And so for people that have gone through the CEP, you've definitely seen this before, but today what I'm going to talk about is how this ties into some of these other pieces that we've talked about. And in general, if you take nothing else away from this talk, I think that this slide is probably one of the most important ones. And the idea here is that when we want to form a good memory, we want to first optimize our attention. Our attention is incredibly important to memory, and if we're not attending to something, we can't remember it. So that's always going to be step one, is to optimize our attention. Step two is to be intentional, and you're going to see some pieces here that are really, that will remind you, I think, of some of the things we've already talked about. So when we are intentional about remembering something, we want to repeat that information or rehearse it. We want to summarize the information. So we kind of put it in our own words. We put it into a format that we know best. And then we want to create some kind of external record. So this could mean taking notes, writing something down, taking a photo, whatever makes sense for the type of information you're trying to remember. You want to create some type of record. So just to give an example, going back to our example of the conversation, we'd first want to make sure that we're in a space that isn't super loud, that we can really pay attention to the person. And then if we want to remember that conversation, we might repeat important details to ourselves or to the person. We might summarize it. So, you might say, okay, so the things I need to do next or tomorrow are take out the trash and do the dishes. That's a summarization to yourself. And then you might also create some kind of record. So you might write down a note to yourself, or you might text yourself, or take a photo of the trash can to remind yourself that you need to do that tomorrow. Now, in terms of this whole process, I won't go through it again, but the idea here is that each piece of that how to form a good memory steps into a different part of this process. So if we want to optimize first we want to optimize our attention to improve this kind of first step of getting the information into our short-term memory. So we optimize our attention to improve that sensory memory and to actually move that sensory memory into short-term memory. Then repeating information and summarizing it is a way to begin that encoding process. So that's really key in short-term memory to transition into long-term memory. And then finally, creating a record is a way for us to cue retrieval. So after that information has been stored, we create a record to make it easier to get back to. And then the last thing that I'll say about this is that there are specific strategies that we can use that really tie into these concepts. So for folks that have not seen my talk on active memory strategies, that's where this comes from. And it should be on our YouTube. So if you want to go back and watch it, you're welcome to. But the idea here is that there are strategies that specifically support encoding and retrieval. Those include things like acronyms. So for example, ASAP means as soon as possible. And that's a way for us to really easily cue retrieval. It packs kind of a lot of information into a small package. Acrostics. So for example, remembering the music scales, knowing that every good boy does fine or deserves fudge is a way to remember those letters. Again, create some kind of organization that our brains can kind of cue us back to information. And then categorizing or chunking information gives us a way to actually organize that information. So when it goes back to the different kind of webs of our memory, it's going to the place that makes the most sense to us. So these are just some strategies for encoding and retrieval. And again, if you haven't watched the video on active memory strategies, I really recommend that you do. I go into a lot more detail about these there. And you'll notice there are a couple that were not highlighted here. And what's interesting about those is these other strategies, so association, creativity, and visual imagery, actually support sort of deeper processing of information. So if we think about those webs of memory, these three strategies, association, creativity, and visual imagery, actually improve our ability to make those webs and to connect them with one another. So association is just making connections between things you know and things you are learning. So for example, if we go back to Jester and his name, we might be thinking, okay, Jester is a dog, he's small, he reminds me of my neighbor's dog, but also his name is Jester, and I, remember going to carnivals as a kid. And so that's creating this really strong web of information. And that's the idea behind association. It's just that you're starting to really strengthen certain pathways. Creative strategies and visual imagery allow you to work with information in a different way, which again just strengthens those webs. So the idea here is that these types of strategies really affect the way that memory works, and they're intended to kind of overcome some of the difficulties that are typically had with memory. All right. And then just to wrap up here, again, if you take nothing else from this talk, this idea of if you want to form a good memory, first optimize your attention and then be intentional through repetition, through summarizing the information or putting it in your own words, and then creating some kind of record to cue retrieval later on.